Okay, so that was wonderful. We'll go straight ahead to Dr. Brian Spain, who's our next speaker. Here we go. Where are you, Brian? There he is. Working at Royal Darwin Hospital since 1997, Director of Anaesthesia since 2001, born in Woomera, South Australia, when it was a rocket range. That's why he's got 3 elbows. Joking, just joking. I'm sure you've heard them all your life. He's involved in the Royal Darwin Hospital resources to Bali bombings 1 and 2. He's an expert in his field. Please welcome Dr. Brian Spain.
I'd like to thank Bernie and Melissa and the organising committee for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you this weekend, and I'd like to share with you the story of Australian medical assistance teams and their deployment overseas, and the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre that's based up in Darwin. So this just gives you a little overview of what it's like up in the top end of the Northern Territory. We do have fires up there, but they're very different to the fires you have down here, as you may be aware. Unfortunately, you don't have any of those extreme fires that we heard about earlier today. So today, what I want to talk to you about is the medical assistance teams and how they developed and why Darwin is really the place that they've come from, about the Australian Medical Assistance Teams and the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre, and a little bit about foreign medical teams and what's happened to them in the professionalisation in the last few years. It's been something that's developed relatively recently, but is going ahead at quite a pace now. And importantly, the role of fire and emergency services personnel in making these teams in Australia what they are, the professional bent that they add to us and really allow us to do our job from a medical point of view. And then go into some detail about the deployment to Tacloban in the Philippines, and then some other deployments. So this shows you Royal Darwin Hospital on a typical night in the wet season. Royal Darwin Hospital started being built back in the early 70s, just before Cyclone Tracy, before the Northern Territory had self-government, so the Australian government got a 2-for-1 offer. The design of the hospital is from Calgary in Alberta. It's the same design as Canberra Hospital, and you'll notice that it's complete with snow shutters up in the tropics. The good thing is, though, we're prepared for anything in Darwin. There will be snow. It's going to be 10,000 years away till the next ice age, but it will come and we'll be ready. But Darwin is no stranger to disaster. It suffered heavy bombing in the Second World War. On February the 19th, 1942, there was as many tons of bombs dropped in Darwin as there were in Pearl Harbor. And as many of you would know, there was much loss of life on ships in the harbour and through the city itself. Similarly, Cyclone Tracy came through on Christmas Day in 1974 and destroyed the city. But it had been destroyed twice before, in 1890 and 1930. And so somewhat frighteningly, we're actually due for another storm as big as that in a year now. Closer to our current time, in 1999, when the East Timor referendum went through and there was huge civil unrest up there were more than 1,000 people evacuated from the UN compound into Darwin. And the city was on a state of standby for many years, not knowing what was going to happen to our near neighbour. But perhaps the most tragic event of all that involved Darwin was the night of October the 12th, 2002. Anyone who's older than 18, I'm sure, would remember where they were when they heard about the Bali bombing. It was a day that Australia lost its innocence in many ways, that we couldn't believe that so many young, innocent Australians on holiday could be killed in such tragic and horrific circumstances. In total, there were 202 people killed in the Bali bombings, 88 of whom were Australian, and more than 60 severely injured people were brought into Darwin over the next 24 hours. There were many severely injured people, and their survival was going to require a time-critical evacuation to facilities where they could be cared for. At the time, Australia didn't really have a well thought out plan of how it was going to happen. I guess we never thought those sort of things were going to happen to our citizens. But you can see there that Darwin was closer, and so as people thought on their foot at the time, they realised that Darwin could act as a forward staging post. We weren't in a position to provide all of the definitive care that the victims would need, but it was somewhere they could be brought and stabilised and then moved on to other centres around Australia, closer to their families, where they would require weeks and months of care. They were brought back in the back of military aircraft, the C-130 Hercules, and you can see them there stacked 3 high and 5 deep. That's a guy that you'll see more of in the future. That's Mr. David Reed. He's a young surgeon at the time who was an Army reservist, and he still works in Darwin these days, looking a little bit older than that. But he was climbing in amongst the injured. At that time, it was purely a military response in 2002. And when they landed in Darwin, we had every ambulance in the entire top end of the Northern Territory to help ferry those people off the plane to the Royal Darwin Hospital. There was a handover from the military to the civilian. You can see all the St John's ambulance workers. So not only the professionals, but all the volunteers were there helping as well to ferry those people. And I'm just there in the corner with a little bit more hair. So soon after that time, the hospital became a frenzy of activity as the people were brought in one after another to be resuscitated and have intensive care instituted to those who needed it. That went on for over a period of 26 hours that people came in from Bali to Darwin, and then onward we moved to burn centres around Australia because the majority of the people had severe burns. And that was really the beginning of the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre. The Australian government realised that in the new age of terror, with Australia's near neighbours through Asia, that we needed to have a more robust ability to respond to an event like that. So it was announced in 2002 after the Bali bombing. It was federally funded, and its mission was to provide leadership, research and training in disaster and trauma management, as well as improve disaster preparedness and response, and to enhance the Royal Darwin Hospital's ability to provide trauma should such an event happen again. Up until that time, disaster response has always been a state-based responsibility, and it still is under the Constitution, and that's what you're all a part of, is the state-based response to disasters. And so, although the focus was on the state, the Commonwealth Government realised that they needed to have perhaps a further vision on how they could respond to overseas events where Australians were involved or where it would be appropriate for Australia to make a response. So the state-based teams still exist, and in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, there were state-based civilian medical teams that deployed, and a couple of others there that I'll go through a little bit later. So the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre works closely with Commonwealth agencies. There's Emergency Management of Australia that many of you have probably heard of, that come under the Attorney General's Department. There was AusAid, which was disbanded and rolled into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade more recently. And there's, of course, the Department of Health and Ageing at a Commonwealth level. So they all work together as part of this national disaster response. And the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre has representations on various working groups that look at how we can improve medical responses to disaster. Importantly, we've also got someone who works with the World Health Organisation now in Geneva that's working ahead at an international level. So the AUSMAT teams are state-based but nationally coordinated. The response may be state. They may go into a response in the local state, they may help an adjacent state, but mostly they've had an international focus in the recent years. They're multidisciplinary civilian medical teams, though we do sometimes work in cooperation with the military. They have training systems, medical and fitness checks for members, a vaccination program and a database so that you know who's who and who's kept up with all of their requirements. You can see there's quite a long list of vaccinations, so if you don't like needles, it's not a good place to join. There's a number of those, and most of those diseases have got 2 or 3 vaccines that they require to be covered appropriately, and some of them need boosters as well. Additionally, you can face some fairly harrowing circumstances, but they're things that are not going to be foreign to you in the audience. But people do need to be psychologically prepared, and we make sure that they get, if they're going to deploy, get a briefing both before and afterwards. And although those of us in Northern Territory are fairly acclimatised to heat, if you're bringing people in from southern climates to work in the tropics effectively, they also need to have a mechanism for heat acclimatisation. There's now developed training manuals for people who are going to deploy overseas. The training is tiered so that you can have a state-based team who undergo a fairly standardised, what's called a major incident medical management and support. And part of that is teaching people who work in hospitals how to work with emergency services out of hospitals. I don't know if many of you have worked with hospital workers, but mostly doctors have got no idea about the command and control structure. Nor do nurses, and that's really important, as you would know better than I, once you get out in the field, that people understand that. So the very beginning is just teaching people some of those principles, and we have ongoing exercises and education for anyone in a hospital who's interested, who meets the other criteria. And then we come together and team, and that's really where the Northern Territory and Darwin, with the funding from the federal government, we've been able to bring together these state-based teams to start to train together, to get to know each other, and to get a standardised training program, both in humanitarian response, safety and security briefings, and how to deal with unsafe circumstances that might arise in an international deployment. They do field exercises out into the tropical savanna of the Darwin top end with the deployable gear. And that's again where we work in cooperation with our fire and emergency services. So the guys from the Northern Territory Fire Service, they function as our logisticians to set up the habitat, look after the water and sanitation, and a lot of maintenance through that. And we could not do the work that we do without them. Part of the training, we also engage the police tactical response group so people can go through a realistic guerrilla ambush if that should occur when they're on a deployment. We hope that they never will, but we try to make sure people are prepared for the worst. There's other internationally relevant ongoing education. There's language courses for people who want to learn Indonesian and other things that might be useful for them on a deployment. And then we have specialist roles, so people who are going to work, such as myself, in surgery or anaesthesia, and our operating theatre nurses, where we train them together, bring them together from all around Australia and New Zealand. We have team leaders courses, needs assessment courses, as well as environmental health and logistics, so that people can do all the things they need to do to have a successful response. This just shows you out in the field. Inside, we set up the tents and actually have the surgeons operating on anaesthetised animals so that they understand the field experience, having two operating theatres in one room, which is a little different to what they're used to in the standard things in Australia. In terms of how the teams get activated, it looks a little complicated, but importantly, the first step always has to be, if you're going to go off internationally, you have to be requested to do so. And I'll touch on a little bit later about some of the people who don't get, what happens when they don't get asked. But the Australian government would never send in a team unless they've been asked by the foreign government to do so. And at that point, even though they may preempt the likelihood that it's going to happen depending on our international relationship with the country, there's a group called the IDETA who get together, the Interdepartmental Emergency Task Force, and that's all those groups I mentioned before. There's Department of Foreign Affairs, Emergency Management Australia, Department of Health, and as well as the military, the ADF and Joint Operational Command. And they look at what's happened in the disaster and formulate what sort of response that Australia could reasonably contribute to that, which might be a health response or it might be an urban search and rescue response. And then they would request one of the agencies who can deliver that, which might be the NCC TOC in Darwin, or it might be one of the urban search and rescue groups that can deploy internationally from Queensland or New South Wales. A lot of that sometimes happens beforehand. If you've got a cyclone bearing down on a vulnerable country, you know that it's going to be destructive. You've literally got days to start to plan it. But when an earthquake occurs, that is always pretty much without warning, and so some of these things have to happen very quickly and won't have had too much preparation beforehand. So when we look at our members and see, is AUSMAT for you? You guys would look at, is the RFSA for you? We look at sort of things that we want to people that are going to volunteer to work with us. Are they able to leave Australia at short notice leave their jobs? Have they got any previous experience in austere environments in low and middle income countries? Are they heat acclimatised, or are they able to do so quickly? Whether they're reasonably fit, whether they're able to work in a broad range of clinical work, because when you go to one of these countries, you have to pretty much be able to do everything. You can't choose to be just a heart surgeon or just a brain surgeon or just to work on broken bones. You've got to be able to deal with everything that comes through the door. And perhaps most importantly, can they adapt to dealing with difficult circumstances? And again, I think everyone in this audience, it would be no problem at all, but you'd be not surprised to know there are a bunch of doctors and nurses who can't cope without their cafe latte and their glamping and their fancy shoes. So they have to be able to eat dehydrated food, camp, go to the toilet in a long drop and not find that abhorrent, or there's just no point in going. So there's been quite a few deployments over the last decade. You can see the long list there that really started with the Banda Aceh tsunami in Sumatra in 2004 and has grown from there. There was an earthquake in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. The refugee boat that had an explosive fire on Ashmore Reef in 2009 that had a response from Northern Territory and Western Australia. There was an earthquake and tsunami in Samoa. The Pakistan floods in 2010 was a joint military and civilian exercise to go over there, and partly where you get deployed, at the end of the day, we're an instrument of the Australian government, so it depends on the government's attitude to where they want to send teams. So back in 2010, the Commonwealth government had a much wider focus, and sending a team to Southern Asia was part of their deal. More recently, when we had the Ebola crisis in West Africa, it's not really part of Australia's perceived mission to go and send government employees over there, so they chose not to deploy a team there. Other things that have happened after the Christchurch earthquake, clearly a country like New Zealand can mostly deal with it themselves, but they were offered a small team that went to help. And I'll go through in quite a lot of detail what happened after the typhoon in the Philippines in 2013. We also had a New Zealand team predominantly that went to the Solomon Islands after a dengue epidemic and after the floods there in 2014 that took an Australian contingent with them. More recently, at the beginning of this year, when Cyclone Pam went into Vanuatu, we had a team that deployed and were on the ground there within 24 hours because you knew it was coming, you could prepare and everyone was ready to go in. And more recently, after the Nepal earthquake, I went across with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to make a health assessment to see what, if any, response Australia should make. So in terms of the professionalisation of these medical assistance teams, that's really only happened in the last 5 or 6 years, predominantly after the earthquake in Haiti. You may recall there was an earthquake in the island of Haiti, which is not very far from continental USA, that had huge loss of life, almost 250,000 people killed, 2 million requiring immediate emergency aid. But in a country that was really a chronic disaster. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, had a fragmented health service and very little functional infrastructure, but incredibly close to the USA. It's less than a 2-hour flight from Miami into Port-au-Prince there. So there was rapid deployment of aid. There were more than 1,000 expatriate volunteers, thousands of USARs, hundreds of international non-government organisations that went in. Money was not a problem. There was $13 billion of USA that went in. But unfortunately, there were large numbers of small impromptu teams that weren't really prepared for what they needed to do. And interestingly, they were still prepared to write about what they did, which helped to demonstrate to the international medical community that this was not the way to deal with something. An example was this 5-member team of 3 surgeons, 1 anaesthetist, and of course 1 journalist had to go in as well. They had limited experience previously working in Haiti. They had very little equipment with them, but they did manage to go in a corporate jet that could deploy them there within 24 hours. And you'll notice that they didn't have a fireman with them. There were no emergency services, which is the backbone of a proper response. So when they went in there, they landed, they found 225 severely injured people in a tent at the airport. They were rapidly overwhelmed by with the inadequate staff, inadequate training, equipment, drugs. And over the next couple of days, they had no access to shelter, sleep, food, water, or sanitation. When they wrote about their experiences, they described that they did a few urgent amputations were done without anaesthetic. Patients had complications from severe pain and lack of equipment. The amputation rate in Haiti was thought to far exceed what had happened in previous earthquakes, and perhaps there were people getting amputations who didn't really need them if they'd had surgeons who were properly trained in how to deal with difficult limb injuries, and the patients had no follow-up or rehabilitation. When they described what had happened, they said the psychological impact of the horrendous conditions encountered by the team left an indelible mark in the minds and hearts of those individuals. So not only were the patients damaged, but the people who went in were damaged as well. They wrote about it in medical journals, and it was discussed widely across the international medical fraternity that how could these people go in when they're not trained or briefed? We don't know whether they were vaccinated. They arrived without invitation. They were not self-sufficient. They went in as a burden. They had no professional standards, and none of those other things listed there. And importantly, no exit strategies. So it actually became very dangerous for them to even try and get out of the country. Unfortunately, there's a long history of under-equipped, unprepared international teams turning up uninvited, medical cowboys. There's a wide variation in their capacity and competency and even professional standards. We do know, because these things have been studied, that you can predict the sort of injuries that you're going to get after a disaster. On the left-hand side there, you can see what happens in earthquakes. There was the BAM earthquake in Iran and Pakistan in 2004, and the Chinese earthquake. And the red is the number of people killed, and the green tinge is the number of people injured. So the number of people injured is much greater than the number of people killed. Whereas after a tsunami on the right-hand side, you can see after the Indonesian tsunami that of all the total casualties, 88% of them were killed in the initial event. And even after the Japanese tsunami, the majority of people were killed. The actual number of people who are injured is relatively small. So after Haiti, the international medical community said, we must be able to do better than this. That is not good enough to go in and respond like that. When money is not an issue, you've got to be able to coordinate teams better than that. Interestingly, the international search and rescue groups, they learnt that lesson way back in 1988 after the Armenian earthquake, that they needed to be organised. If you're getting teams coming from all around the world, you can't all just get in there and do your own thing. There were buildings that were being searched 3 times that had already been searched before. There were buildings that hadn't been searched because there was no one coordinating it. And so search and rescue 25 years ago sorted themselves out and now have a highly coordinated international framework to respond to. And yet that really didn't happen in the health area until 2010 after Haiti. So when we respond internationally, there's a few humanitarian principles we like to abide by. First of all, that you have to be invited to attend, that we can't just waltz into a country. We need to respect their national sovereignty. We often ask the question, how would we like it if we have a disaster in Australia and you suddenly find the Malaysians and Indonesians just waltzing in and doing whatever they think is necessary? We'd think we would not want that. So we've got no right to go and do that to one of their countries. So you need to be invited in. You then need to work in conjunction with the host government, and there is a good United Nations framework to work under. And we use the utilitarian principles to try and do the most good for the most people. So sometimes you have to do things a little bit differently from what you would do at home where we have less limited resources. And that's part of our training, is for people to understand that ethical dilemma you sometimes face, that you can't do everything for all of the people in front of you. You've got to think about how you can help the most people with the resources that you've got. And in general, in disaster, to replace destroyed infrastructure with your services, but don't exceed local infrastructure. So if an area of the country that you go into never had intensive care, then you probably shouldn't be providing intensive care. There might be, as I'll discuss, some reasons to provide very short term, but you can't keep someone on a ventilator in a remote part of the Philippines or Nepal for 4 weeks, even though we might do that in Australia, and you could potentially save their life, because you'll be creating expectations from that community that will never be able to be sustained. So if you're going to work in conjunction with the host government, you've got to be able to provide something that will be ultimately sustainable for them. So mostly just replacing what's been destroyed in the disaster. So the benefits of having a national scheme or an international scheme is that you can have national registration, that the countries can understand what sort of responses might come in and who'll be able to provide them, and that they can coordinate their foreign medical teams. You can, if you're coordinated together, you can minimise the gaps and the overlaps of services, and that the teams that come in have to declare and sign up that they can provide a appropriate standard, a minimum standard of care. So that's the book that they were, and it was only published in 2013. Interestingly, it was published literally about 1 month before the typhoon went into the Philippines. So they, in that, tried to lay out a framework so that we could match the deployment of foreign medical teams with the needs of the country, provide benchmarks that international teams had to meet, that when they arrived in a country that they register, they have a standardisation of their service, and that they have a clear communication framework between the recipients and the providers, and that the teams that come in are accountable for the quality of care that they're providing, so that you need to be, have to be registered. If you're going to work in a certain specialty area, you should be registered to do that in your own country. You can't suddenly deploy to a low-income country and start doing things that you wouldn't normally do in your own country. So that framework sets up 3 levels of teams. There's a type 1, or what we call outpatient emergency care, and there's often large numbers of those that might go in and replace GPs and small health centres. There's the type 2, and that's predominantly what Australia provides when we've gone into places, is an inpatient surgical and emergency care service, so that you can have an operating theatre, you can provide inpatient care, you've got an emergency department, but you don't actually provide intensive care. So the third type is really when you have highly specialised care, including intensive care, and there's really only a couple of teams in the world that can provide that level according to this new framework. And so they're the standards about registration, that when you do your work, that you report at regular intervals to the host country and the United Nations, that you keep confidential records so people can know what's happened to them, and if your team leaves, someone else can take over and know about that, that you adhere to guidelines, and that the specialist staff who go in have had some training in sudden onset disasters or war surgery, so they understand the differences in dealing for those sorts of people, and the majority of them have actually got some experience of providing care in austere environments. That shows you a map from the United Nations of all the people that went in after the typhoon in the Philippines. So you can see very large numbers of teams, but at least now there's some level of central coordination. So through the Australian teams, we have a national database of vaccinated, medically screened, fitness tested people. We've now got a standardised uniform and equipment. There's a cache which is kept in Darwin, but which can be deployed anywhere with any of the teams. And we have close links with DFAT, who are always going to lead up any of these international responses, and maintain other links with Emergency Management Australia and the Department of Health and the ADF. We also work cooperatively with the Kiwis. New Zealand have developed, a little after Australia, the New Zealand Medical Assistance Team, and they've got a lot of connections into the Pacific, which, as we know, is part of our zone now, and we do a lot of joint training with the Kiwis. But you can see there, in terms of proximity, there's a lot of blue water with island nations that they are in close access to. I just wanted to touch on now the role of police, of the fire and emergency services, because, as I said, they really are the people that enable us to do our work. So that's on the ground in the Philippines, and we call them logisticians, but they are all fire and emergency services workers in their day job. But the reason they've been selected is because of their individual skills. Often they bring other skills like an electrician, carpentry, IT skills to help us maintain the medical system. They help us set up the water and sanitation in fairly adverse conditions. We've got a lot of fairly sophisticated tentage, so as I'll show you later, when we're setting up the camp, we need everyone, the doctors, the nurses, or everyone has to help, but these guys set it up and down repeatedly through all our training exercises, so we become their worker bees and they guide us in what to do, and in the more difficult components, they generally get us to get out of the way because we cause more trouble than we're worth. And they work tirelessly. It's hot and it's humid, and there's no job that's too difficult or too menial. We all know we're focused on providing professional care for people in the disaster zone, and they'll do whatever's required for that. So this just shows you a time lapse. And although you guys in New South Wales are incredible, I'd just like to show you what our guys can do in 40 seconds. So this is one of our surgical training exercises. We set up the shelters. It's not the complete setup when we respond, but you can see they move pretty quickly. The tents go up. and then soon you'll see the dignitaries arrive. So the people have usually marched through the heat to arrive there, doing a vehicle convoy. And then once the vehicles drive in, which will happen any moment now, and then there's always, as ever, there's politicians and media turn up, and that's them at the front of the surgical tent there with the orange stripe down the front. So now I'd like to go through in a little bit more detail about a clinical response, perhaps the biggest one that we've had, which was into the Philippines after the Typhoon Haiyan went in November 2013. And I'm just going to start to break up a little bit later to relax, just a little video.
Forecasters had predicted the Philippines would be smashed by a storm with brutal force. The warnings were well founded. Wind gusts well over 200 kilometres an hour tore buildings to shreds. With a storm front 600 kilometres wide, there was to be no escape for millions of people in its path. Filipinos are hoping for the best, but with more than 12 million people in its path, Typhoon Haiyan is threatening to be the worst in a series of disasters.
Aftermath of one of the strongest storms ever recorded. Hundreds of thousands of people spent the night in evacuation centres set up across the country.
Thousands are dead, many more now homeless and exposed. 4.3 million people were in the path of Super Typhoon Haiyan, and while that's a big number, it's the small things that matter now: food, water, shelter.
As Typhoon Haiyan made landfall, streets were turned to rivers and houses reduced to rubble. It may be some time before the full human cost of the typhoon is known and large-scale relief efforts can begin.
It's been 3 days since Typhoon Haiyan hit the city of Tacloban. The extent of the devastation is now clear. Not only have people lost their homes, they have no access to power and running water. Food supplies are low. The people of Tacloban want help.
So it was at that point that the Filipino government did ask for help. And just to show you a bit of the background, they're no strangers to typhoons. We think we've got it bad in tropical Australia. That map shows you a track of every cyclonic or typhoon that's ever occurred in the world, and you can see up in the Philippines that density of red, there's so many, and they're the strongest sort. The red ones are the category 5. So they get more typhoons per year than anywhere else in the world, 19 a year, at least 6 to 9 make landfall. But Super Typhoon Haiyan, what makes a super typhoon obviously is its wind strength. So anything with speed greater than 240 kilometres an hour. And Typhoon Haiyan had sustained winds for over 10 minutes of between 230 and 280, sustained over 1 minute of 315, and gusts up to 378 kilometres an hour. So it was the fourth most powerful typhoon ever recorded, but in fact the most powerful to ever make landfall in recorded history in the world. And many of you are probably familiar with the idea of what happens with a cyclone or a typhoon, but you get the eye, so you get the wind strength building up as you get closer to the centre, and then suddenly it stops, and then it comes back with the same ferocity that it just left. So when the eye crosses over, it's very terrifying because you go from nothing to these immense wind speeds in a very short time frame. That just shows you the track of the typhoon as it built up. So you can see that you can be planning and plotting, and we know that although there were thousands of lives lost, there were also thousands of lives saved by people being evacuated from low-lying areas that were thought to be impacted on. There was one mayor in one town who's attributed at least 4,000 people in his district by insisting that people leave any of the low-lying areas in his area. So that just shows you the islands. It's the eastern Visayas part of the Philippines with the islands. And you can see there in the middle, you might be able to see on the map, a little bay at the top of which is Tacloban City. And that just closes in, and you can see a peninsula there jutting out into that bay, then the Tacloban City just on the other side of it. So, and that airport is where we landed, and that's an area that took a huge brunt of the damage, and then the main city of Tacloban just across from that bay. And this just shows you a little graphic. Tacloban City is up the top there, that'll come through. You can see the eye going just beneath it, so enormous wind speeds that went through there. And this graphic just shows you, if you look for what changes colour to red, that's the storm surge. So you can see the height of the waves going up to storm surge. So in fact, what happened in Tacloban was really as much a tsunami as a typhoon, and that's what killed so many people and did so much damage. That where it goes red is 6 metres height waves. So the city of Tacloban, you can see the population density, quite a few people out on that peninsula, which is where the airport was, but a huge number of people just on the other side where this massive storm surge went in. So it was the most destructive typhoon ever in the Philippines, with more than 6,000 dead and 2 million homeless. Tacloban City itself was a moderate-sized city. It had over 200,000 people. It was low-lying and coastal and equatorial climate. It had 2 public hospitals and 5 private hospitals. So it was actually a reasonably prosperous sort of place. After the typhoon, with its 6-metre storm surge, 90% of the structures were damaged and destroyed. There was no airport, no roads, phones, water, electricity or security, and there was one hospital which was partially functioning. It was a 3-storey hospital. The top storey got blown away with the winds, and the bottom storey got inundated by the storm surge, so there were just a few beds in the middle. But unfortunately, most of their functional areas, like their emergency department and operating theatre and an electrical plant, were all on the ground floor. That just shows you the level of destruction in the city that's been alluded to with that video. As you can see, there wasn't much there that's not damaged. The one thing you do have to pay homage to is the humble palm tree. They are incredible. They can go through that and they're still standing. They're looking a bit ruffled, but they're still standing. Just to give you an idea of what a storm surge can do, this is a freighter that was based around Tacloban near the Eva Jocelyn that had been moored in the harbour, and that's what it looked like afterwards. Washed well up onto the land. But again, as I showed you earlier, when you have a tsunami, and unfortunately a storm surge is like a tsunami, there's a huge loss of life. And in fact, there are often more killed than surviving casualties. And so there was enormous tragic loss of life there in the Philippines. So in terms of the response, within a day, the government declared, so more than a state of emergency, they have a state of calamity. So we knew it was bad. And although the Australian government didn't announce their assistance package until the day after that, of course they had been planning it because we knew that typhoon was heading in and we knew how strong it was. So there was an Australian medical assistance team was activated on that Monday, Julie Bishop, who was the Foreign Minister then and now, who declared that assistance package that would include the team being deployed. So it would be a national team heading out of Darwin. And because we needed to deploy quickly, the first phase of people are often predominantly from the Northern Territory. So although we had 37 people go in the team in total, there were 25 from the Northern Territory. So on that same Monday, everyone was issued their uniforms, red bags that I'll show you the contents of shortly, when we were ready to leave by 8 o'clock the next morning. And that's what goes inside a bag. You basically have everything pre-packed by the centre, and all you need to do take is a change of undies. So that initial team that went in, of which I was a part, we had 6 logisticians. And so they're up there right at the top appropriately, that you do not have a functional team unless we've got our fire service logisticians, because they're the guys who make it happen. They're who enable us to be totally independent, sorting out our habitat, our water, sanitation, food services. We took a big team of doctors with a focus on emergency doctors, one infectious disease specialist and a public health physician, a couple of surgeons and a couple of anaesthetists so that we put on the operating theatre, and then a bunch of nurses. And I have to tell you, not enough nurses. That we, for the amount of work that we needed to do, we needed a lot of nurses to run a facility around the clock. We fortunately were able to get some of the Filipino nurses to come down from Manila to help us run that. We also had some paramedics in the team, a pharmacist and a radiographer. So that's the team outside the NCC TRC warehouse in Wanelli, all ready to go and uniformed up. And you guys know the value of uniform, because interestingly, back in the early 2000s when people went up to after the tsunami in Aceh, it was a bit of a rabble of people. Everyone looks a little bit different. There's no doubt how you professionalise yourself just by all wearing a uniform. But you can't do these things to deploy internationally without the assistance of the military. So the RAF moved us in. Although it was a civilian exercise, there's no civilian air assets that can move that sort of stuff into those zones quickly enough. So we had the services of a Hercules C-130 that took all the people up, and a C-17 Globemaster, which took all the equipment up, more than 20 tonnes of equipment. And any of you those who have seen those, they are an incredible aircraft that's just like a basketball stadium in the middle of it, how much equipment that they can now take. That's them being loaded up. And interestingly, that little, the forklift, how important that is. I never really understood how a bit of equipment like that can totally transform how you can respond, because when you've got 20 tonnes of equipment, you just can't manhandle it all. And when you get on the ground in a place like Tacloban, those forklifts are at an absolute premium, because every aircraft that lands needs one of those to get stuff off. So at that point, because of unrest in Tacloban City, it's difficult to get accurate information, but there was some uncertainty about the security situation, and the Australian government doesn't like deploying us into uncertain security. So we got deferred for another 24 hours until it was clear way things were going. So we went the next day, on the Wednesday. That's everyone getting their briefing. For the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade actually led it off, because we're going as Australian representatives to a foreign country. So DFAT actually lead it off. That's everyone walking out into the sun in Darwin to load up into the Hercules. And that's what it looks inside. You get strapped into a reasonably uncomfortable seat, and it wasn't too far. It's only a 5-hour flight from Darwin into Manila. And everyone gets issued with a big lunchbox by the military. They actually look after you pretty well. And we landed, we didn't go straight into Tacloban. We landed in a city called Cebu, which is in the middle of the Philippines, further south than Manila, where we had to stay the night and get a briefing and get a clear idea of exactly what was going to be happening the next day. And it is a bit, I'm sure it's somewhat akin to when you guys are driving towards the fire. When you're going into the battle zone, everyone goes a little bit quiet, and the mood changes to become a lot more sombre as we started to come in and approach and see the level of devastation that we were going into as we came into land at the Tacloban airport. And that's what the air terminal looked like. There you can see that got washed over by 6-metre waves, so completely destroyed. And it had taken a few days. The US Marines had actually gone in and reset up communications, and that's one of the things that stops the response, is trying to get... You can't really these days get enough equipment in to make a response unless you can get aircraft in there, and you can't land aircraft until the airport's safe. And so the US Marines went in and made that airport safe. But that just shows you a few shots about the level of damage that occurred around the airport. And you can see there thousands of people waiting to get out. And although we'd had these messages about uncertain security, you saw the sort of damage that happened in the city. And if people have been waiting 4 days without food or water in the sun, it's no wonder that when an aircraft landed and people thought it was going to be the last one out, that they were rushing the aircraft. And that's what the uncertain security was, that there were people rushing the aircraft. But having said that, you still can't make a hospital facility and then have the whole thing looted. So security is important. And that was the Filipinos getting on the aircraft. As we arrived, they were taking off to Manila and Cebu to be with other families, where, if possible, so they could escape the ravaged city. And as often happens in these disasters, it's hurry, hurry, wait. So we landed on the ground, and then we have to work out where the hospital is going to go. Communications are difficult. There's a lot of politicking going on. So those of us that weren't in the key leadership team spent a bit of time sitting around on the airport. It was like a military aircraft show. There was the US Ospreys, the Sea Kings, every military aircraft you can think about. The noise was just constant 24 hours a day for the whole time we were there, of airframes, because we ended up being located next to the airport. Lots of rain, but a little bit of time to dry your toes. So we set up camp finally on the Friday. So it was literally by then 7 days since the typhoon had gone through. And you can see that big concrete pad just out the back of the airport. That's where the organising people from the Filipino government decided they wanted us to set up our hospital. So we were lucky that compared to lots of muddy patches that you might have had, we had a huge concrete slab that was being built for a warehouse, but they hadn't put up any of the walls, so it was just this absolutely massive concrete pad. So it was actually a good place for us to set up. And that's when the work really begins. And I have to say that was probably the hardest day for me of the entire deployment, was the work that everyone had to put in to setting up the tent. And that's where our logisticians from the fire service are actually crucial, because they're the ones who know how these fairly sophisticated tentage goes up, and they would guide us. And we were their slaves. You can see it just there in early morning, but it was very hot work. We'd taken drinking water in with us, because at that stage we haven't set up a purification plant. And everyone's got to be part of it, setting up the tent. So we're led by the logisticians, but we do the hack work. And even by 8 o'clock in the morning, when the first tents are going up, people are finding every little bit of shade they could get, because it was very sweaty work. So that was the habitation. So they're the Campmore tents that we lived in, and I'll show you inside those. There, the medical facility itself is in those Alaskan OPEC tents, which are some of them are air conditioned. And I was lucky enough working in the operating theatre that we got to work in air conditioned comfort. So we were perhaps the luckiest medical workers there. So there's 4 of those that exist in an H-frame with patient wards. So the patients who had to be inpatients got to stay in air conditioning. There's a paediatric ward and the operating theatre. And then the brown tents are what we call the Western shelters, and that's what formed the emergency department and the communications area. So patients would arrive and they'd go through a triage point where they'd be assessed as to what sort of problem they had. And you can see it's just across the road from the airport. There's one of those C-17s from the US Air Force that had just landed. So they'd go inside the medical tent after they'd been triaged, where they'd see the emergency doctors, and there was a seating area and a lying area depending on what sort of illness and problem people had. So as soon as that shelter was set up, our logisticians get to work with setting up the operating theatre, which is a little bit more sophisticated because it's got air conditioning. It's a 2-layered tent, and it's got some special flooring so it's waterproofed, and that's the ward area where the patients go. So they're only on camp stretchers, but compared to the conditions that they'd been in, it was a little bit more comfortable. But water purification is a really important part. To run an advanced medical facility, you need a lot of water. So those collapsible onion skin bladders, they could hold 5,000 litres each, and we're using more than 10,000 litres a day, because for every operation you need more than 100 litres of water, plus what you need for the people, the staff and the patients for other sanitation and care. So water supply and water purification is a really important and big part of what the logisticians would do for us. And they had that little tractor to drive around transporting people to the airport who needed to be evacuated. So that's what we lived in the shelter. So you can see it's perfectly functional, but it's not glamorous. So if you're from the latte set with your high heels, it's not going to be a camp for you. And we didn't let anyone in who snores. Every morning we'd have a meeting, so communication is always important, so people would be allocated their tasks. And in all these disasters, the media is always there. I could not believe how much media were always there. The media get in there before anyone else, before any health response. And so the leadership team really have to spend quite a lot of their time talking to the media, but which is important because we need to get the word out there to the other responders of what our facility can do. We had the US Marines landing their Seahawk helicopters out the back, bringing in people from some of the remote villages. And they would also, with some of their bigger aircraft, would be able to evacuate people out. So keep flow happening through the facility so that if they were still taking aircraft up to Manila. So some people who had family up in Manila, we could get out there. Security, as I mentioned, is important, and that's the Filipino military who helped guard our compound that we were on. It's not luxury, but there were some sheltered showers there, so people could get a shower each day. The toilets are not fabulous, but they're not too bad. The boys even got a bit of hessian because there weren't too many trees still standing. Just to go into the operating theatre, what we do, the very first case was a guy being brought across who was trying to board on one of the planes who had a massive hernia. He had a hernia that had literally half of his bowel inside his scrotum. And so that was him and the team. So we had to get that happening before our loggies could get the air conditioning happen. So you can see it was pretty sweaty work, particularly for the surgeon on the left there, David Reed. For the anaesthetist, it's a little bit easier. We can walk up to the fans and cool ourselves off. That just shows you the distribution of the work, that it increased pretty quickly and was steady, but then it does start to tail off. And so after, that's for the 4 weeks, we had 2 teams that went up for two-week deployments, and you can see that it's appropriate that they extracted themselves. So once the local hospital is up and running again, you don't need these international teams to stay there for too long. Predominantly the work was on adults, but also on some small children, which is why you need staff who can deal with the people across the ages. And interestingly, a lot of the injuries actually occur after the cyclone, as you saw from that storm surge, that unfortunately many of the initial casualties were killed and they did not have survivable injuries. But afterwards, in this destruction, when people are crawling through looking for their loved ones and some meagre possessions, that's often when they get injuries with nasty cuts in their foots. So it does get a little bit gruesome here for those of you that want to look away. So they're the sorts of injuries that you see, and unfortunately there's a huge amount of diabetes up in the Philippines, and so these wounds that get wet and infected in diabetics where there's no medical care start to go rampant and get really nasty wounds that would need the surgery, and that's the sort of surgery that you have to do for people to clear up these nasty wounds. So that's inside the tented facility. You can see we've got an air conditioning duct up there, so we were pretty lucky. But an important part of what we are able to deliver is the steriliser. So there are some standards where you have to make do and compromise, but sterilising instruments is an absolute standard, and so we need to be able, it's one thing that set our facility apart from the rest, and being able to deliver surgical care is that you can sterilise the instruments. And that's a crucial part of that is the logisticians who help maintain that, because any of that slightly sophisticated equipment has a tendency to break down, and that's again a great service that our logisticians would provide, would be to keep that equipment running. Inside the operating theatre, we had, it was simple equipment, but it did the job. We could monitor people appropriately, we could deliver them oxygen. So we couldn't get oxygen cylinders, but these little machines called oxygen concentrators that can deliver oxygen as required. Anaesthetic vapours, we had X-ray equipment there. Blood was hard to come by, but the US military had some. But what we've developed in the last couple of years is an ability to do group and cross-matching of blood to provide that services. And for people, unfortunately, there are still occasional amputations, but there are ways of providing analgesia to those people without causing them too much trouble. and danger. A child who had a palm drop on his head, who could get surgery that would have otherwise caused him probably a fatality. But we also worked with the local surgeons so we could collaborate with them in providing care and providing them with a facility. But our patron for the whole trip was MacGyver. You always come across problems, you're never sure what you're going to do with them. So MacGyver was on the wall of the operating theatre and everyone had to do a lookalike. And you can see David Reed, our surgeon, he wasn't doing too well, but once he took his glasses off, he's looking a bit better. The whole team would do MacGyver lookalikes. And even the Filipinos had to fess up as well. The Filipino community is largely Catholics and they were in difficult circumstances. So we had the Marine chaplain come in and bless our facility and turn some of our water into holy water with a little thing. But even he had to measure up to MacGyver. Documentation is difficult. As we said, we would leave the patients with a handheld record, but the surgeon would often write on people's wounds or on their dressing so that we'd be absolutely clear when they needed to come back to theatre and what sort of things they needed to happen to them. You don't have a lot of sophisticated equipment, so sometimes you had to apply the sniff test to work out what the bug was. The bug infection. In general, we didn't provide intensive care, but we did do a little bit of the lady who came in with her after she'd had a baby only 2 weeks ago, had 4 other children, and she was dying from fluid on the lung, from heart failure, from a rare condition that happens, and we were able to support her overnight through a little bit of intensive care so that she got through the night and was able to then get onto more advanced care in Manila. Yep. So it's just a little short video here just to lighten it up a little bit, to show just even a few days afterwards at what things were looking like in Tacloban.
You can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space with the air like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Here come bad news, talking this and that. Well, give me all you got and don't
I just have to show you the fireman. So just to touch on briefly the other deployments that we've gone, that was a joint military-civilian one to Pakistan, to the Solomon Islands, which was joint with New Zealand to replace the emergency department that was being overwhelmed at the time. We did some Ebola training, so although we weren't sending a team to West Africa, we knew there was a possibility that there might be, as Ebola was spreading, that it might come into one of our near neighbours and that there would be a requirement to deploy there. That's the team that went into Cyclone Pam after that went through Vanuatu. And again, the logisticians did an amazing job there helping repair the hospital. So within 24 hours, they'd made areas of the hospital that were unusable with roof damage. They'd fixed all of them up and they were helping the locals clear away the damage. And that was just a brief shot from when I went up to Nepal to have a look about how we could help. And although we didn't provide a medical team, we helped them set up a rehabilitation network for the people up there. So hopefully that gives you an overview of what Australian medical assistance teams are doing, but importantly, the incredible role that fire and emergency services do in conjunction with the health professionals to deliver that.
I think we're at lunchtime, so we might pass on questions. Are you going to come to lunch? Okay, just because we're just a tad over time, if you've got a questions, he's available for lunch. See you at lunch and back here at 13:45. Thank you.